A woman goes on a nice Sunday drive and passes by her local church to find that it isn't looking so hot these days. As a matter of fact, it's crumbling to pieces as if it were hit by a bomb. She knew the church was fully intact, so she makes the nearest U-turn, only to find it's back to its usual condition. She was left baffled as to what she had just witnessed. A man and his son were walking around their historic home, and as they headed into the living room, there was a roaring fireplace, along with an old woman dressed for the 1600s using a spinning wheel, sitting not in Dad's recliner, but in an old rocking chair. She casually looked up and acknowledged the man and boy's presence without a word. In a blink, the room was back to normal, recliner and all. A young man was walking down his street to the corner store when his foot hit something, nearly sending him tumbling to the ground. He quickly caught himself, and while glancing downwards and back up, he finds himself suddenly transported to the 1950s. And when he looks away and back again, he was back to normal. These are but some examples of the time slip phenomena that have been occurring to people all around the world. The concept was first introduced in Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court in 1889. It's even invaded pop culture, from A Traveler in Time by Allison Utley to Back to the Future in the recent time-mangling Netflix series Dark. And while intentional time travel is seemingly impossible, there are countless reports of ordinary people who have suddenly experienced a slip. Now, some of the slips, which take the experiencer back to the past and suddenly back to the present, usually confused about the whole affair, are rare, and some are very, very strange. One such time slip occurred to a group of young men in England, and it took them back to a small village and left a bizarre, unexplained mystery in its wake. It's October 1957 in Suffolk County. 3 British Royal Navy cadets, William Laing, Michael Crowley, and Ray Baker, were in the middle of a training exercise of map reading in the English countryside. Their objective was to follow a simple route through the area, observe several target locations, map a route to a waypoint, make notes of what they observed, and report back to their superiors upon completion. It was a nice sunny day, and the men were on task, but enjoying the pleasant scenery as they went. But soon they were about to cross through an unseen threshold into the bizarre. Along their route, the men passed a small village named Kersey. It was a cozy little hamlet of only a few hundred people, and as the men observed it, it seemed like just another normal quiet day. Church bells rang out as smoke from the chimneys stretched towards the blue skies. Since Kersey was an assigned location along their route, they approached the village to observe it. But as they did, things allegedly got very weird. It began with the silence. The church bells were no longer ringing, the birds stopped singing, and even the sound of the wind seemed muted, as if a wall of silence had descended upon them. Everything seemed still, the leaves not stirring on the streets, the branches of the trees even paused, everything seemingly frozen in time. Even some ducks in a nearby stream were standing motionless. And maybe even weirder still was that there was no one out walking about, despite it being a pleasant sunny day. Even the smoke from the chimneys had stopped smoking. Indeed, as they entered the village, it seemed entirely deserted. And as one of the cadets would say of the unsettling, eerie scene, it was a ghost village, so to speak. It was almost as if we had walked back in time. I experienced an overwhelming feeling of sadness and depression in Kersey, but also a feeling of unfriendliness and unseen watchers which sent shivers up one's back. I wondered if we knocked at a door to ask a question, who might have answered it. It doesn't bear thinking about. Things got even weirder once they began exploring. They saw no cars, no phone wires, no bicycles. Even the road itself was now made of old beaten cobblestone. Now, there were quite the few older-looking homes, some almost medieval in Kersey, but the men could not see a single modern building around them at all. All of the houses looked hand-built and framed with timber, their window glass a greenish hue covered in a film or grime of some kind. It wasn't just the town that seemed to change, but the entire season as well. When they observed the town from afar, it was clearly fall, changing leaves and dropping temperature. One cadet mentioned it was verdant, and the trees were that magnificent green color one finds in spring or early summer. The men decided to peer into one of the seemingly deserted buildings, and were surprised to see it was some form of butcher shop. One of the men had said about it, "There were no tables or counters, just 2 or 3 whole oxen carcasses which had been skinned and in places were quite green with age. There was a green painted door and windows with smallish glass panes, one at the front and one at the side, rather dirty looking. I remember that as we 3 looked through that window in disbelief at the green and moldy green carcasses, the general feeling certainly was one of disbelief and unreality. Who would believe that in 1957 that the health authorities would allow such conditions?" When they were done peering through the creepy butchers, they moved on to other houses, but there was nothing in there, no furniture and no sign of life at all, as if they had suddenly been abandoned by residents who had taken all of their possessions with them. They must have left in such a hurry that the smoke from the chimneys that they had seen also stopped. Then they went to search for the church they had heard, scanning above the abodes for its tower to use as a landmark and then get their bearings. But it was nowhere in sight. The church simply disappeared as if into thin air, even if they saw it as clear as day from afar. Where had it gone? Where had everyone gone? At this point, the 3 men were feeling very unsettled and spooked. There was an ominous, vaguely menacing feeling of dread coming over them, and they decided to get out of there as quickly as possible. They had included in their report that after they left the village, everything suddenly went back to normal. The church bells rang out again. The chimneys were once again billowing with smoke. The landscape was painted in the oranges, reds, and yellows of fall, with the crisp air of October hitting their faces. The church tower was also once again there, towering over the surrounding buildings, and the 3 astonished cadets could not account for any of it. Although their superiors confirmed that they had reached Kersey, the stranger details of the account were brushed off at the time, as they would just dance around in the back of the cadets' minds. It wouldn't be until years later that the case piqued the interest of paranormal researcher Andrew Mackenzie of the Society for Psychical Research when he received a letter from 2 of the cadets, Laing and Crowley. He met with the men who even took him to the village, back to where the bizarre story happened. The more he learned from the men, the more convinced he became of their story being true, that something very strange had happened to the men. One of the main things that impressed Mackenzie was that the account was very historically accurate. For instance, the building with the cow carcasses indeed had once been a butcher shop, although in 1957 it would have been a private residence. Other observations of the layout of the town also matched true historical records, which was information these cadets would not have likely known. Mackenzie deduced that not only did they travel through a time slip, but also knew exactly what era they went to. He surmised that because the village had been mostly deserted and the tower was not visible to them, then it had to have been before the tower had been completed, and when the village had been ravaged by the Black Death. By his estimate, sometime in the early 1400s. He was so impressed with the case that he would include it in his 1997 book on time slips titled Adventures in Time. Of course, there have been skeptics of the cadet story, some pointing out period inaccuracies and other things that weren't quite right, such as the green glass windows, which would have been very expensive for all of the villagers of the time to afford. Others examined the account of the butcher shop. It would have been very unlikely for a butcher shop to have so many cow carcasses, with meat being a luxury item, in such a small town. A butcher having that kind of stock would be a more common sight in a much larger town than what was known to exist there. In the end, there isn't a way to know exactly what happened to those men in the beautiful English countryside. Did they accidentally get transported to another time through a method that will most likely never be understood? Or is there a more down-to-earth, rational explanation? Sadly, the answers to those questions may never be found. Hey everybody, if you like what you heard, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more Unknown Files here on Unknown Territory. And most importantly, thanks for watching.